from the National Association from Trailers, Trucks, and Pack, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the industry of heavy vehicles in Mexico and the relationship we have with logistics, mobility, and the environment. First of all, I would like to tell you what UNPAC is. It's a National Association of Buses and Truck Trailers. We have 14 associates, 14 manufacturing plants, and two remanufacturing plants for diesel engines. We have these plants in 10 states of Mexico. You can see on the slide where these plants are located, and you can see all the plants that we represent. These are our 14 partners. Mexico is the first exporter of truck trailers in Mexico. We are the fourth place of heavy load trailers, six on the heavy vehicle producers worldwide. The impact we have in the economy is 84,000 jobs, direct jobs, and 18,500 are direct jobs, and we account for 1.1 of the GDP. These are some of the figures from the industry. The first chart in red is the production of heavy vehicles. In 2019, we broke the production record of heavy vehicles in Mexico with 198,000 units. This was due to exports. Exports in 2019 accounted for 168,000 heavy commercial vehicles. These are load and passenger trucks and buses, but our internal market has been the most significant. Retail sales accounted for 42,000 vehicles, and we have some 53,000 vehicles records, but the internal market is still our challenge. We should be able to replicate the success we have in our exports in the internal market, increase production, and therefore increase the number of jobs that we provide. There is another variable. These are the charts in green. These are the sales of retail heavy vehicles. How many used vehicles are imported from the U.S.? If we look at last year's figures, out of the 42,000 vehicles, that is for every 100 vehicles in the internal market, 25 to 30 used vehicles are imported with a 16-year-old use. And there are now some initiatives in Baja California to regulate these vehicles, and we want also to include these vehicles so they can be regulated. This type of lack of controls and at customs affects us, and we would like and trying to regulate something that is already illegal and the effect that it will have in the internal market. I'd like to comment that the automotive industry of heavy vehicles has a foot on logistics and another foot on mobility. We're very linked, close or linked together with mobility. Part of the negotiation with the USMCA was to meet the new rules of USMCA in 7 years because the environment regulations are planned for the following 6 or 7 years. So this will take us to the regulations. There are a couple of slides, so I can talk about the relationship we have with the industry, not only in logistics, but also mobility and environment. Our products are literally the engines of logistics. 56% of the goods that are transported on the highways among the different states, 56% of the cargo is done in heavy trucks, heavy vehicles. 71% of the value of foreign trade merchandise in the foreign market is done through heavy trucks. There are over 5 million crossings be- annually between Mexico and the U.S., and these are truck trailers and load trucks, and practically 100% of the goods that are transported are with heavy loads. Sometimes these are vehicles that depend on the configuration. They can be two class or third class light trucks and some Torton and other type of trucks. The impact that logistics has, and many of you are experts in logistics. I'm not going to stop here, but what are we going to see much more is the integration between heavy trucks and new technologies.
En algunas exposiciones a nivel mundial.
In some exhibits worldwide, you have seen autonomous vehicles in Transport Pack in Puebla, and a company showed an autonomous truck. You could get on the truck, and in other exhibits we have seen integration with cargo trucks. E- Even loading the truck automatically with robots or with another scheme of sharing the cabin of the vehicle. The cabin can be exchanged truck for a bus for passengers and or drones. The drones will not be flying from warehouse to deliver the product. There are prototypes because from a commercial vehicle, the drone can take the package and deliver it to the households. And this has been triggered by electronic commerce. I know that in the States this happens very often, but even in Mexico, I have purchased through internet. You can order in the evening and you will get the package the next day because this was done through a heavy truck or heavy vehicle or a light vehicle. 96% of passengers in Mexico that move from one state to another is done through buses. 27% of students in Mexico take buses in the cities. 41% of the employees also use passenger buses. And so the impact that we have as heavy commercial vehicles is huge, whether they are long or short, heavy vehicles, or those that are articulated vehicles. There are many examples of mobility pyramids. There's a sustainable mobility pyramid, a vulnerable mobility pyramid. Each one uses a mobility pyramid that is more convenient. This is the general one that is used, and it is very important because one of the great challenges we have been facing in Mexico is that even though the pedestrian is first, then the bicycle is second, the third public transportation, fourth logistics and cargo, and fifth automobiles. This is not the way the states look at this. There are many entities or states that give preference to another means of transportation, and unfortunately what we have seen is that cargo transportation is demonized, and we want they want to charge more money to get into the cities. There are restrictions in large cities in Mexico, or certain schedules that are restricted for these heavy vehicles.
Todas las
I believe that all companies are very aware of this. What happens here is that you have big logistics centers like Mexico City, which continues to be the biggest one in the country. It still has a lot of industry inside Mexico City, and you cannot forbid the access to some of these companies from one day to the other. So in some countries we do urban planning and we give them enough time to go towards this. But what we're facing here in Mexico are new mobility laws that are on track in 6 months and want to implement some of those restrictions without the right planning. So this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Mexico, to position on its right level in the pyramid, the logistics. And another big challenge that we have in mobility is a big trend that is coming, as I told you, of the new mobility laws. We have more and more ministers in mobility, which is very valid, but we ask for the heavy duty vehicles to be considered with their rightful importance. But what's happening in mobility? We see the first pedestrian bridge or crosswalk bridge, and this is the one that we've seen for many years in Mexico. And the new design in mobility, which yields the preference to the pedestrian, is the next model. It's not a bridge, it's just the crosswalk on the street. And this is what we're seeing more and more in cities. And in the crosswalk bridge, we could say that vehicles have the preference, and at level crosswalks have the are yielding the preference to the pedestrian. They may seem minimal, but we see more and more of this in different cities, especially here in Mexico City. Another trend is the elevated highway that we have in Mexico, which gives a preference to a light vehicle, and the at level highway is for heavy vehicles. But we have now the exit that was made, the highway exit in Puebla, which is paid. It's a tollway, but now the buses have at most 75.5 tons in Mexico that are using this in infrastructure. So we have to give the specific weight to each kind of vehicle that might circulate. And of course, in terms of buses, we see this topic of infrastructure or specific lanes or specific infrastructure for massive transportation of passengers. And we go to the last item here, which is urban planning. If this is done just overnight without the right planning, we can affect mobility and logistics. This is not a slide against cars. I told my friend Guillermo Rosales here, this is a reality. Part of the solution where we have highways and restricted highways, or when having limitations regarding infrastructure, it's undeniable that we're going to promote the massive transportation of passengers. I would add a phrase that I heard in the association: the public transportation of passengers helps democratize, helps reduce the gap. And in other parts of the world, we see people with high income and low income that are probably not using their cars. This, besides reducing emissions and besides promoting the use of less public space, helps us keep citizens at the same level, which I think would be very helpful with what we're living not only in Mexico but in different countries around the world. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about the environment. We have all the technologies available. We have diesel technologies. We have ultra low sulfur diesel, and I'm going to tell you about a problem that we have in Mexico. We have biofuels, we have natural gas, we have hybrid vehicles, we have electric vehicles, and now we're even seeing drones. And the automotive industry is part of the solution to issues in mobility, logistics, and environment. It would seem that the industry and, of course, all the transportation vehicles would have some kind of emissions, but the industry also has solutions that are zero emission and electric. So what's important here that we have to move towards that. For instance, a bus, a public bus that is charging you 7 pesos in Mexico cannot be compared to a bus in Europe that will charge you 50 euros for a single-way trip, so one-way trip. So if we want new technologies, we have to invest, or we have to inject resources into this to promote these vehicles and reduce emissions. This wouldn't always be paid by the transport owner because it's usually something that falls on them. How much would a heavy duty vehicle reduce? Well, for instance, a truck with 18 years, if you change it with a new one, it would reduce 73 tons of CO2, which represents like 19 trees. In specific aspects of non-articulated material, from non 2 to NOx 5, which is the current technology in Mexico, 83% less of NOxes, and articulate material in 50%. So sometimes we're just focused on the technology that we have, which is HEPA 7, Euro 5, and we want to move to Euro 7 and HEPA 10. Of course, this would reduce emissions, but we forget that the 2 million heavy-duty vehicles that are circulating in the cities of the country and the highways are the ones that contaminate the most. And of this amount of vehicles, most of them registered with license plates that are federal are 163 companies that are small and medium businesses and business owners that do not have enough, cannot afford to change their vehicles into new ones. I would tell you that, of course, we have to move into new technologies, but instead of just pressing new vehicles, 39,000 are sold a year. What are you going to do with the 2 million old vehicles out there that are generating more NOxes and articulate material and particulate material? The potential to renew the fleet is around 67,000 vehicles per year. This is an analysis that we did with the ANDA and the School of Economy in UNAM. Let me tell you that in Mexico we have a serious issue with the supply of ultra-low sulfur diesel and the relationship with the movement towards new environmental goals. Several industries did a sampling in 2019, and we saw a coverage of ultra-low sulfur diesel of 81%. 323 samples. We thought we were going well, but then we have an administration shift, and the government policy, which is very valid, they used to force Pemex to comply, and now they want to strengthen Pemex, and we think this is an economic policy that is valid towards our fuel industry, but it's putting us between the rock and a hard place. We moved from 81% of ultra-low sulfur diesel after the canceling of investments for many years. Pemex cannot supply clean fuel, and they can only supply 19% of the municipalities in the country. In other areas of the US, for instance, ultra-low sulfur diesel was mandatory, and then HEPA 10 came out in 2010. In Mexico, through the 44th law, the government asked us to move towards environmental changes without the fuel, without the right fuel. So we want to have meetings with the Semarnat minister, because we want to have both technologies until we have the fuel available. It would sound illogical, but if the new standard moves forward and we do not have the fuel, and we have several transportation owners here, no one is going to renew their fleet, because you cannot risk your vehicle being stopped or raising your maintenance costs in the vehicle. So you're going to wait 7-10 years to renew your fleet. So we want HEPA 7 and Euro 5 that just got into Mexico 7 months ago until we have ultra-low sulfur diesel supply. And if you can have that supply, you can move towards HEPA 10. We want for both technologies to be together here, but we don't want this to be mandatory yet. This is a delicate issue for logistics because the 44th standard in emissions literally has a criterion where if you're not measuring well the emissions with the right fuel, the speed of the vehicle is lowered down to 20 kilometers per hour, and the power of the engine is brought down. And who could improve your logistics with that restriction? The average age of the fleet in Mexico is 18 years. This is the biggest challenge we have. Of course, we have to move into new environmental technologies, but we have to see what we're going to do with the old fleet, and that's a big challenge. In heavy load trucks, this is SCT vehicles. We have 176,000 vehicles with over 9 years, and in buses, we have over 45,000 buses, which are over 15 years. The maximum age is 15 years in highways in Mexico. So that means that half the fleet of buses is circulating in our highways irregularly, illegally. And the total is a potential renewal of fleet of 220,000 units over 20 years of age. So this is the chart of what's being put in the internal market. In new vehicles, we are selling the same that we were selling 20 years ago. In 2000, we placed 42,000 units, as well as in 2019. So the population went up 36%, the fleet registered in SCT 29%, and the internal sales are just increasing 2%. So this is not proportional. This is the biggest challenge that we have due to a different number of reasons, lack of innovation, incentives, and financing. But this is something that we have to work on. And this is our proposal as an industry to promote the renewal of fleets, incentives. If you want to move towards new technologies, this has to be incentivized, but non-mandatory when you don't have the fuel. Financing, we understand that very soon we'll have a cut of the finance rates in Mexico. We hope this would help, but the development bank should inject resources into small and medium business owners, which are the ones that need that the most, which is very oriented and aligned with the current administration of President López Obrador, and to reduce emissions as well. And we saw the figures of everything related to buses. Of course, professionalization, not only on how to handle the vehicle, but also the company, and the 44th standard, but well supervised. We cannot have a regulation with 50% of buses operating irregularly in the country. So this is the information I had for you. This is my handle for social media, Miguel Elizalde L, and I'm at your service. Thank you.